Which actually, you said a very good point I heard previously, where you said there are an infinite number of wrong answers in science and very few actual answers.
Right.
And so for science to be real would be for scientists to say, well, I've done the 4 or 5 years of research. It's not true, this route. So there's no point following anymore. That's very hard for somebody to do, isn't it? And imagine funding wise, how on earth would a group be able to get funding if they always proved that they found nothing?
Well, and that's so in theory, the experimental method, right, is you get a hypothesis and you're supposed to do your very best to refute it. And the odds are it's wrong because you just said most hypotheses are wrong. For every right hypothesis about causal factors in nature, there's an infinite number of wrong hypotheses. So most experiments end up failing, but you can't acknowledge the failure because if you acknowledge the failure, you won't get funding anymore. It's funny, there's a similar thing that happens in Twitter, in social media in fields like mine. Because I'm challenging the conventional wisdom, the world is full of people who criticize my work, which is fine. And occasionally their criticisms are correct and I learn a mistake I've made. If I acknowledge the mistake, and by the way, just by saying this, I'm going to get in trouble. If I acknowledge the mistake publicly, people will say, look, Taubes admits he fucked up.
Yeah.
Therefore,
yeah.
we can't pay attention to anything he says.
Yeah.
And now, so I'm not going to do that, right? I might fix it in the next edition of the book, but there's a social pressure not to do the very fundamental thing that every scientist has to do, which is to admit they screwed up.
Yeah. yeah.
Now, having said that, people will say, why even talk? If the people who dislike our arguments listen to your podcast, they'll say, well, listen, hey, look, here's Taubes admitting he's never going to admit that he makes a mistake. Therefore, we can't ever pay attention to him. Whereas if I tell people I'm a scientist, and of course, should the evidence contradict my beliefs, I'll change, which history tells us never happens. That's why Maxwell said, is it Maxwell or Planck? One of them said that science proceeds funeral by funeral because no one ever admits they're wrong.
Yeah.
They can't acknowledge they're wrong. It's virtually impossible to do. So if you admit that you can't acknowledge it, then you're a person who doesn't have to be listened to because you've just admitted that you'll never accept that you're wrong. Whereas if you assume that you're unique and you will change your opinion after 20 years arguing the opposite, so you're obviously now self-deluded, you're somebody we can listen to. It's very complicated.